For my UDL instructional plan, I want to show how I redesigned the slide deck that I used to originally teach this lesson. First, I added estimated times and more detail to my week 11 agenda. Previously, I had just the 2 lessons listed, but not the information about the introduction or exit ticket, and the breakout rooms are an addition that I will discuss later. By giving students more information about timing, I hope to facilitate personal coping skills and strategies, since a 75-minute math class can feel very long to many students. I also added learning goals to guide appropriate goal setting. The first 2 goals will be informally assessed through chat and emoji feedback, while the third goal guides the more formal exit ticket assessment activity. All assessment in this lesson is formative, since we are at the beginning of a unit, but the first 2 goals are prerequisite skills for students to access the rest of the unit, while the third goal refers to a standalone skill in the second lesson. In my original lesson, I started the discussion by asking students to share what they already knew about probability through the chat. By adding a slide with the question, I am offering an alternative for auditory information. This activity also served to activate or supply background knowledge. This is the first student fill-in slide that I added. I usually write on my own slides and encourage students to take notes and/or screenshots, but by sharing the slide deck with the students in advance, they can use the structure of the slides to take notes if it is helpful to them. This helps facilitate managing information and resources. By emphasizing probability as a ratio, I am also highlighting the big idea of probability. In my original lesson, I had drawn each of these diagrams on the whiteboard to clarify vocabulary and symbols, but by adding the graphic organizer and making this slide deck available for students to use for capturing their notes, I am facilitating managing information and resources. This slide was originally directly after the agenda, so all of the introductory work we did to this point was done on the whiteboard instead of being included formally in the slide deck. Including the essential question of the lesson on the slide helps guide appropriate goal setting for students. As we moved from the introduction of the unit into the content of each lesson, the bulk of class time was used to go over examples. This class is hungry for direct instruction and modeling. I added boxes to this slide to help organize the workspace, both to help students follow along in my own work, which can sometimes get convoluted, and also to provide structure for students who choose to take their notes using this format. I also added guiding questions that students can use to guide their information processing when working on independent practice. In addition to adding optional structure, I added intermediate steps where necessary to help break down the problem. For example, only the bottom 2 boxes here were originally given, but in this case it will be helpful for students to draw out the options since the numbers are small enough to do so to guide information processing and visualizing. This will then give them a concrete example that they can transfer to a more abstract problem where drawing may not be possible. In my original lesson, students had been given a game to play prior to class called Math Club Elections. At this point in the lesson, we discussed their findings and predictions, but because this class is so social and chatty, I wanted to make this a breakout room to foster collaboration and community, and also to give them a break from my lecture. In their breakout rooms, I expect them to be on task, but they can use their microphones or chat to get out some of their desire to share, minimizing threats and distractions for when we return to the whole group session. I added a blank slide to capture students' findings when we return to the main room. All students are invited to share in the chat, and we will use this space to highlight patterns and relationships derived from their observations, which will lead us to deduce the formula. I will introduce that notation here as it relates to their findings, optimizing relevance, value, and authenticity. Once students have developed the permutation formula based on the pattern observed in the Math Club Elections activity, I'll introduce this anchor chart breaking down the steps of utilizing it. Students can use this chart when calculating permutations in their exit ticket if needed. We have now really laid the groundwork to move into the next lesson, which is structured much like the first. This slide was added to highlight the big idea of this lesson and to clarify a common misconception when permutations and probability are introduced together. The following 3 examples are structured much like the ones in the previous lesson. Each example also has a note at the bottom to prompt me to ask for student feedback at the end of each example. In the online conferencing software we use, feedback emojis are only shown to the teacher, so this is a private way for me to develop self-assessment and reflection. The largest piece I added to my lesson was assessment. Previously, much of the live time was spent with me sharing information with students and asking for student responses for informal formative assessment, but it was hard to identify the lesson goal since students were not asked to do much. Although they have independent practice outside of class time, I wanted to include formative assessment of every student within the lesson and give them a chance to act upon their supposed new knowledge. I created 2 options for students optimizing individual choice and autonomy. Option A is to complete a 1-problem quiz provided by me. Students have a variety of methods to respond and communicate if they choose that option, including audio, video, a picture of written work, or typed work. Option B asks students to create and solve their own problem. I have so many creative students in this class, so I left the options here as open-ended as possible, allowing them to choose the medium for their creation. I also added an option for students to work on either of these options with a partner in a breakout room, since I appreciated that in this class this year. By adding in assessment, students now have a way to demonstrate that they've met the learning goals of this lesson. Finally, this next steps slide helps students to understand what they should currently be working on and what is coming up to help students plan their time effectively. Like this slide, many of these changes can easily be applied to each lesson, along with more intentional goal setting and assessment, and I hope that through these changes I can use the UDL framework to make my courses more accessible to all students.